Hi everyone. Gavin and I are here today to talk about two circular economies that are already operating in our state, and that is the curbside recycling system and the New South Wales Container Deposit Scheme. Thank you. I'll just start off by giving you a short introduction into the New South Wales CDS. So this is how the CDS looks like to the average consumer or member of the public. So as a product stewardship scheme, the bottlers, Coca-Cola, etc., they pay for the scheme. They fund the 10-cent refunds, and they also fund the management and operation of the scheme. And obviously, we all, in turn, fund the scheme through increased drink prices. MRFs are also allowed to participate in the scheme. They act as sort of like individuals, so they don't get additional funds for processing, but they are allowed to claim the 10-cent refund for every eligible container that they process. And MRFs deal directly with the scheme coordinator, so they don't go to collection points. There's a defined and legislated process for MRFs to claim refunds, and really importantly, MRFs need to show that they will process the containers before they are allowed to get that 10-cent refund. So what Gavin and I are going to talk about specifically today is that CDS refund that MRFs are eligible for. So that CDS refund goes directly to MRFs, but of course councils are the ones that provide MRFs with the containers. So councils have a stake in that CDS refund, and in the legislation there's provisions for councils to get a bit of that refund, and that's basically what we're going to talk about today. So how's the CDS tracking so far? We heard the Minister talk about 300 million containers recovered through the scheme since it started. It started on the 1st of December last year. I just pulled figures from the Return and Earn website last night and did a calculation to see how much, what percentage the CDS is recovering. And it's around 33%. So 33% of eligible containers generated in New South Wales are recovered through the CDS, and the rest are presumably either being littered or are in the curbside recycling system. And in terms of collection points, the CDS, the network operator, has already exceeded the Minister's stated target of 500 collection sites with over 600. So how much is this CDS value actually worth for MRFs and councils? Modelling that MRA has conducted puts it at around $120 to $130 per input tonne to a MRF. So that should be easy for councils to do a quick calculation to see how much is available. And so this is a refund value that MRFs will receive. But I want to talk about a few things that you should keep in mind when councils and MRFs begin negotiating over that sum of money. The first thing is that the CDS is still maturing, so we're only 5 months in. We are likely to see a dynamic period. The two graphs that I showed previously showed that the recovery rate is still increasing and the number of collection points is still increasing. Until those sort of plateau, the CDS refund value is still likely to change. And if those two continue increasing, it's likely that the CDS refund value that MRFs can get will decrease. Another thing to note is that MRFs will be impacted to a certain degree by the New South Wales CDS. So as containers are recovered through the collection points, they're coming out of curbside recycling. Modelling done by MRA estimates that the loss in weight of the average curbside recycling bin could be up to 17%, so 17% by weight. And obviously for a MRF, if you're getting less tonnes in, both your gate fee revenue and your commodity sale revenue will decrease overall. And there may be some changes in maintenance costs or operational costs, but we think it's around zero break even. And there are real fixed costs that MRFs need to face under the CDS relating to audits conducted by the scheme coordinator and reporting requirements. And then there's China's national sword policy. I actually wasn't at the panel earlier today because I was preparing for this presentation, so I hope I don't cover things that you've already gone through today. But the main point I want to make is that we've all heard about the ban, and we've heard about the National Sword campaign, we've heard about Blue Sky, but I want to point out that China has a stated policy, right, to end or phase out the import of solid waste by the end of 2019. And some of you may have already heard that they've already announced the intention to ban metals as well, like later on, I think in this year or in 2019. So China has stated in its policy that it's on a pathway to focus on its domestic recycling capacity. So everything that we've seen this year, last year, it's not likely to reverse soon. That's not to say that other markets won't open up. So China's actions have resulted in reduced import licenses, some suspended processing operations in China, and other flow-on effects that have caused global commodity prices to fall. And this has had a really serious impact on MRFs. So MRFs have had a fine-tuned business model for the last few years, right? Some MRFs have been able to earn so much from their commodity value that they've been able to offer councils rebates for collecting recycling. But that's all changed with China National Sword. So the dramatic drop in prices under China National Sword, so going from, let's say, paper mix, like $200 per tonne to $50, for example, etc. If you bundle it all together, it's around $100 to $110 for paper and plastic. So that's the impact, $100 per tonne. That's the impact of National Sword. If you factor in glass, which obviously has nothing to do with National Sword, but is also a challenge that MRFs are facing, you're looking at around $150 per tonne in reduced revenue for MRFs. And obviously, this reduction in revenue, as you can imagine, has a significant impact on a MRF's business model, and many of them are saying that they're no longer profitable under the new commodity prices and existing gate fees. So I just want to talk about, now that we've gone through a few issues that you should bear in mind when you're negotiating, you being councils and MRFs. I just want to go through 4 different scenarios in which you can, manage this transition. So there are 2 groups. There are councils and MRFs that have entered into a contract, a processing contract, before the 1st of December 2017, which is the scheme commencement date. You can negotiate a CDS refund agreement, and there's a legislative provision for the MRF operator to bring the MRF operator to the table, basically. And obviously, if you're in an existing contract, your MRF operator may have already come up to you and said, hey, we need to look at increasing prices. Now, you guys have 2 options. You negotiate separately, and you have 2 separate agreements, one for National Sword and one for CDS, or you do it together. So like I said, CDS, we estimate currently it's at around $110 to $120 per tonne, and National Sword's at around $110. So they're kind of even. You may want to sort of directly offset one with the other, but just bear in mind that National Sword's still got a long way to play out. And as you saw in the diagrams the graphs I showed you, CDS also has a long way to sort of mature and plateau. So just think about the risks associated with negotiating both together and sort of using one to offset the other. That's not to say that you can have 2 separate agreements and from a council perspective, you use one to plug the other. But just bear in mind if you decide to sort of bundle them together and let them try and get them to offset each other in the long term, because it might not play out that way. And the second option is, second group of councils and MRFs are those that have entered into a contract after the 1st of December 2017. Those councils and MRFs, those councils no longer have a legislative provision to bring MRFs to the table. So basically, you need to integrate or be aware that CDS needs to be integrated into your processing contracts. And National Sword will most likely be showing up in your processing contracts whether you like it or not. So there are two options there. You have two tender prices, so you've got your traditional processing price, and you have a separate one for CDS. That CDS option may be, a percentage split. It may be a whole number, whatever you like. Or you ask for one tender price and ask the MRF to basically include all those ups and downs in the one price. I'll now hand over to Gavin, who will talk about the legal implications.
Person at least. All right. Really happy to see a packed crowd. I have to say, I saw a lot of people getting up and down at the last session. I thought they were clearing the room, not having to hear a lawyer in the very last session of this afternoon session. So I've got about 9 minutes to just hit the really high points on the legal issues. There's a lot more to this, but I'm just going to hit the real high points when it comes to council and MRF negotiations. Sorry, there we go. Not sure what's, all right. So, not sure what's happened to the order of my slides. There we go. So, the key point for councils is it's about leverage. And what that is under the regulations, MRFs stop receiving the refunds, the 10 cents, the tap turns off on 1 December 2018 unless they satisfy one of three things. There's a refund sharing agreement and the council notifies the EPA that it's fair and reasonable. Don't know why a council would enter into an agreement that's not fair and reasonable. The second one is that there's no refund sharing agreement but the council notifies that it's still fair and reasonable. And the third one is that there's a processing agreement after the 1st of December 2017. One of those has to happen, if not, the tap gets turned off for the MRF. And that's really what drives these negotiations. So a couple of issues. Some clients have asked about change in law clauses in contracts. For me, yes, while there may be a change in law because there's new legislation, fundamentally change in law clauses are usually about law changes, costs increase for the contractor and therefore they claim that increase, and that's not what's happening here. Here, in fact, we've got a windfall, so change in law clauses aren't really suitable and I generally steer clear of them and stick to the next thing, which is the refund sharing agreement. That's our first trigger. Refund sharing agreement specifically defined under the regulation as an arrangement between a council and a MRF for the sharing of those 10-cent refunds from municipal recycling, from municipal curbside, effectively. But what's a processing agreement? Well, that's your regular recycling contract, effectively. It's an arrangement between a local council and a MRF operator for processing, for reuse or recycling of domestic waste, etc. And that's a really important distinction to bear in mind. Now, Charlotte talked about the various options, whether you have a standalone agreement, whether you put everything together. I tend to agree with Mike Ritchie's view from this morning, which is that it's better if they're separate. It's much easier because they each have their own issues, and I certainly think a clean standalone refund sharing agreement is an easier way to go. But you know, it comes down to your priorities, which is what you want to actually get out of that, whether you want to wrap everything up, whether there are different issues that you want to address in those negotiations. But, something I tell my lawyers, and probably lawyers need the lesson most of all, is KISS, keep it simple, stupid, when it comes to contracts. And if you can keep it simple, then you've got, less room to stuff up or for something to go wrong. Now, let's just think about the green sword for a moment. So you're a council, your recycling contract, your MRF operator says, look, we're hurting here, we're hemorrhaging money, and we need to renegotiate and vary our recycling contract. And we're going to change the unit rate that we're getting, maybe going to change a bit of the services around, etc. You enter into those negotiations. After a couple of months, you've reached an agreement, you sign that agreement. Great, you've addressed the green sword, but there's one problem. You've ticked one of those triggers, which is you've entered into a processing agreement after the 1st of December 17, and that leverage the council had to turn the tap off after 1 December 18 has disappeared. So it's also important when we're dealing with other issues with our primary recycling contract to keep in mind those 3 triggers, and to keep in mind that you may also have a refund sharing agreement negotiation going on. All right, let's think of another example. Let's say we negotiate a refund sharing agreement and there's a formula in that agreement, which we think covers the overheads and costs borne by the MRF operator, addresses the decrease in tonnage that they're getting, and we think it's got a fair formula to cover those issues. And after a year, the council says, you know what, actually, we're getting screwed over. We've got the raw end. This MRF operator's barely giving us anything after, we apply this formula, and we've got a real problem. And say they enter into a dispute. What happens then? Well, from my perspective, certainly my reading of the regulations is that notification to the EPA that you've entered into a refund sharing agreement and it's fair and reasonable, or there's no refund sharing agreement and it's still fair and reasonable, whatever that is, that's a one and done. You notify the EPA, the tap turns back on, and it doesn't stop. So what it then becomes is just a regular contract dispute between the MRF operator and the council, as with any other contract dispute that a MRF operator and a council have. And you can't bring in that independent umpire, that EPA, to 2 minutes left. Was that? Okay. We didn't discuss the hand signals before. And that just plays its course. So there's really not a great way to address that, because you can't re-notify or de-notify the EPA, but just keep that in mind. Another issue is a number of councils deal only with their collection contractor and not directly with the MRF operator. So what happens then? Well, if there's a concept called privity of contract. So say I've entered into a contract with a collection contractor, and that contract says I'm going to get 5 cents out of every 10 cents from the MRF downstream, and the collection contractor enters into another contract with a MRF operator for that. Privity of contract means if I end up not getting my 5 cents as the council, I can't go along and sue the MRF operator. I don't have a contract with them. They don't know who I am. We've got no relationship. I can only sue the collection contractor. And so this one is a bit more complicated to deal with. There's certainly a number of legal avenues. You can enter into a tripartite agreement, which is a fancy lawyer's word for a 3-party agreement with all 3 parties. Certainly it's better for the council to have a direct contract with the MRF operator if possible for that reason, so you can deal directly with them. But in some cases, a collection contractor may not be happy for that to happen. They may have multiple MRFs they utilise, etc. But certainly those MRFs downstream will want something to be done, because their tap will get turned off on 1 December 2018. Similarly, if something's not been done, if the council hasn't notified the EPA that it's fair and reasonable, that they're not in agreement or whatever it is. Finally, joint negotiations, certainly worthwhile pursuing for councils, but something to be aware of is the potential for ACCC issues in those. I don't want to go into that any further. It's just another thing to bear in mind. So there's a lot to these negotiations, and there's a lot of data, a lot to think about. Certainly, the first priority is to gather data so that you know where you stand, both for the councils and the MRFs, to have that data, and you know, certainly where someone like Charlotte comes in, because you can't negotiate and enter into a good agreement that's going to hold up through those ups and downs of the CDS without that data. Start those discussions early, and you have only one shot, so get it right. That's it from me.